I can't wait to start campaigning.
Well, it should be easy for you. So far, no competition.
Yeah, but Coca-Cola is by far the world's #1 soft drink, and they spend more money than anybody on advertising. I guess that's how come they stay #1.
Yeah. Okay, well, good luck there, Tracy.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Gold. I'm your host, Daniela Taplin-Lundberg. I'm here with my right-hand woman, Becca Camerata, head of production. Bex, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Daniela?
Good. So what are we talking about today?
Well, we have a very appropriately timed podcast today because we're talking about Alexander Payne's 99 classic, Election.
And Barack Obama calls this his favorite film about the political system.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. But really, it's just a movie about high school election, starring Reese Witherspoon, really sent her into the stratosphere, and also launched Alexander Payne, one of my favorite directors.
I love Alexander Payne too, and I really respect Alexander Payne's career because I was looking up his credits in anticipation of this episode, and he is very specific in the types of films that he does, and he doesn't just shoot films out. His filmography isn't massive, but it's so good. And to have a director who's worked for this many years, whose filmography is so curated, I think is really, really impressive. He's such a great filmmaker.
It's so true. And I think like one of the hallmarks of what he does is he like sort of blends political satire with like dark humor and a lot of heart. And so you can always identify an Alexander Payne film when you're watching it. And so this is probably my favorite. And I'm excited to get going with Albert Berger and Ron Yerxa, who made the film happen. So guys, you've produced so many of my favorite movies. We've decided to focus on Election, which I just rewatched, and that movie really, really holds up. So we're going to dive into that. But the first thing I want to ask you, which I've been asking a lot of the guests, is how did you guys meet up and how did you guys decide to partner up in the business?
Do you want to take that, Ron?
Yeah, well, we met up New Year's Day, 1982 in Chicago. Albert was a graduate student at Columbia. I was like in my second year of being an executive, which at that time was at CBS, because I entered the whole film world quite late in life. I did a bunch of random other stuff. So anyhow, 82, then we went our own way for a while, and Albert can fill in his missing years. But in 89, we went to the Sundance Film Festival together, having both kind of felt we were tired or burned out or hit the end of the road we were on, executive and for Albert writer and then an executive. So that started it when we, it's a whole different story and different film, but met Steven Soderbergh, and that led to our first film, King of the Hill.
How did you know that you were going to be good partners? I mean, I'm always so curious when partnerships last for decades and decades. How did you decide to leap and jump in together?
We were good friends for that whole period of time before we decided to join up. And, as Ron said, I was a screenwriter, and I had gotten very, very, sick of that life of sitting in a room. I had a partner at the time. I found that I was writing screenplays that I was getting paid to write screenplays that I wouldn't necessarily want to even see. And the stuff that we were writing on spec that we really cared about, nobody was buying. So it had never occurred to me before to be a producer, nor Ron, I don't think. But we were both fed up with what we were doing at the same time and just decided to take a leap.
How does that transition happen from executive and screenwriter to producer? Like, what made you think, like, I can launch the ship? That feels like a big leap to me.
Well, just to expand on what I was saying before, I mean, one thing that was very frustrating to me was that as a screenwriter, you had to sort of prove yourself by writing something and then convincing other people that it was valid. It had never really occurred to me before because I'd wanted to be a filmmaker when I went to film school and all that. As a producer, you can read something that you can fall in love with, and then you can figure out how to put those pieces together. You bring it to a director, which is actually what happened with Steven Soderbergh. We stumbled into the very first screening of Sex Lies Videotape, in '89, and there were only 50 people in the audience. And Ron and I, at that time, had a book called This Boy's Life that we loved, and we had convinced the author of the book, Tobias Wolff, to let us run with it. And that was at the time we went to Sundance. So we had a book that we loved that, had gotten great reviews, and we went up to Soderbergh to talk about that book. And, somehow that conversation eventually turned to King of the Hill, which was a very similar book that he had always wanted to do. So, it got us in a dialogue with a filmmaker that we were very excited about. And from then we were off to the races.
That is so incredible, because I remember Sex, Lies, and Videotape, changed the face of our business in a way. I just remember when that movie premiered, independent film suddenly, it felt like blasted off. That was really such a momentous year. The fact that you guys went up to Soderbergh right after that, that's pretty incredible. So guys, you made the Soderbergh film, you got that produced, and then
right.
Take me back. Did it just become like an immediate, full-time job partnership after that, or what happened?
Well, there were some good moments. One thing, Ron, remember when the naming of Bonafide, Stephen did not want more than one name on the film, and so we couldn't have our names in our company, and so we had to come up with 1,000 names that we were trying to figure out, and Bonafide finally became it. And then the funny thing was, for some reason, we didn't think that we would be needing to develop things that would follow up King of the Hill. And so we looked at each other and said, what's next? And that basically led into Election. Over the years, now we've got 20, 30 development projects we're dealing with. But at the time, for some reason, it didn't dawn on us that it was going to take a long time to develop the next one.
Okay, so start at the beginning of Election, because it really is such an iconic film, and it's so dark and hilarious and amazing. Tell me how you first got Tom Perrotta's manuscript. Was it published yet? Start from the beginning.
Well, we had a mutual friend who for a while was, I guess, a girlfriend. She, and she went to UCLA graduate school, and anyhow, it's just one of those relationships that when she was making a film and also wanted to be a writer, both screenplays and I guess short stories and novels. But she was at a writer's colony.
Janice Shapiro was her name.
Well, yeah. I was trying to be discreet, Albert, but okay. Okay.
You got to give her some props.
No, we can
That's
give her
right,
credit.
that's right.
I'm not sure she wants all the credit I was about to give her, but okay. It was a fun relationship and all that. And she had made a short film at UCLA. Anyhow, she went to this writer's colony, met Tom, and he read from a different book. What was the name of that? The wedding?
The Wishbones.
Oh, yeah, the Wishbones. And then she came back saying, we've got to get the Wishbones. And then Albert, take it away.
Yeah, well, you know what Janice said to us, as Ron said, he was reading from this novel, The Wishbones, and she thought that we would respond to what she heard and it would make a great movie. So we had read his book of short stories, Bad Haircut. We called Tom up on the phone, and Tom said, well, I can't give you the Wishbones because the novel's not done, but I do have this unpublished manuscript sitting in my desk drawer. It's called Election, and he said, I haven't been able to publish it because some people consider it young adult fiction and other people consider it a literary novel and nobody knows what to do with it. And here's what it's about, and what do you think? So we said, yeah, sure, that sounds interesting. Send it to us. And we read it. We really responded to it. And then we had a meeting over at MTV Films with our friend David Gale. He wasn't our friend at the time. And David, said, well, what are you guys interested in? And we told him about this manuscript we had just read. And he got excited about it, and we submitted it. And Paramount ended up agreeing to option the book through MTV Films, and we were off to the races. So that was a great, easy start to it all, but that began a very complicated process of finding the right filmmaker, really.
Did it matter that it was unpublished? They didn't care.
They didn't care. I think MTV Films was excited about it because they thought it could have a great soundtrack. It would have a lot of youthful energy and all that. Paramount at that time wasn't paying so much attention to it. For us, it was really, I guess, our first studio deal, really. King of the Hill was a independent experience.
Well, it was a universal pickup, basically.
Yeah, it was a negative pickup, but we made it completely independent of the beast that is the studio. This was really our first studio project, and so we were very excited about it, but also aware that it could be complicated, and of course, it was.
Tell me how you zeroed in on Alex Payne, and did it take a long time to get there? Had Citizen Ruth come out? And give me the scoop.
Well, it did take some time to get there. Initially, MTV had a strong point of view about the kind of directors they were excited about. Paramount had their list. We, from very early on, we had zeroed in on Alexander Payne. I had met him in 1991 at the Sundance Film Festival when he was there with his student film, UCLA student film, The Passion of Martin,
wow,
which was an amazing student film. And the funny thing was, at that point, I was working for Marvin Worth. That was the period where we had to wait for King of the Hill to happen. And I remember going up to Alexander and he said, I said, would you like to come into Paramount for a meeting? And he said, I don't do that. It was like, and I thought, well, gee, this fella is pretty confident. He's just made a student film that nobody's seen yet, other than it had made the rounds. But anyway, that was a long time before this. Then cut ahead in time to 98 or 97 when we had read the book Election and were trying to figure out who the director was. And speaking of girlfriends are kind of a theme, my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, Ellen Steloff, was friends with Alexander. And as Ron and I were trying to put the film together, Election, she invited me to join her at a rough cut of Citizen Ruth that he was screening to friends in Venice. And so I went to one of those screenings where everybody's sitting around on the floor and all that. And I just thought, man, this guy really has delivered on the promise of The Passion of Martin. And, Ron and I started talking to each other that this was the guy that ideally we would like to get involved with Election. However, we had to go through the process with Paramount and MTV of the various filmmakers of the day that they had in mind. And thankfully, what ultimately ended up happening was we were all at Sundance again. And by the way, Sundance was a huge festival over the years for us. We met Soderbergh there, and we could go on and on about it. But we were at that first screening of Citizen Ruth. By the way, we had given Alexander the manuscript to Election. He had read it. Jim Taylor had read it. They were very interested in it. But Paramount and MTV hadn't yet seen Citizen Ruth. And so they were all in the house that night. And the film screened, and the audience went wild. And I'll never forget the head of production at Paramount was there and declared, he's the next Jonathan Demme. And with that was the sign that the seas had parted and it was possible.
Oh my God. You guys had lined it up so perfectly. Was Citizen Ruth an acquisition title? Like, had it been picked up, or was it, I can't remember, was that?
I think it was a Miramax film, wasn't it?
It was? Okay.
I think they picked it up after production, perhaps, or maybe during production. That was a Kathy Conrad produced movie. And I think it was Miramax. Yeah, exactly. But it took that, what would you call it, that sort of a stamp of approval from Sundance to open the door and allow for the director that we were hoping would emerge to emerge.
I love those moments of magic where you get everyone in the room and it works and the audience loves it and you're off to the races. So then you're in development. Jim and Alexander are writing. Is it going according to plan? From the get-go, do you feel like he has the right sort of vision for it?
I remember the early drafts were very exciting. Wasn't that your memory, Ron?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to create exactly that state of mind. I mean, because the screenplay, had voiceover and freeze frames and all that always made people think, is this necessary? And, it's not the studio most welcome way. So it took a while. I mean, all credit to them. Those techniques are really part of what make it such an excellent film. But
yeah, and those voiceovers, the thing that was interesting about the book, it was written in those sections. Each chapter was a different character's point of view, and so it would bounce between the perspectives, and Alexander and Jim embraced that element of the novel, much to our we were very happy about it. I personally love voiceover. And this sort of trope in development is voiceover is a crutch and you should never use voiceover. But Alexander and Jim went hard in the direction that the novel had already explored. And that was really one of the great unique things about that project, the screenplay, the movie, all of it. So
it's not even technically voiceover the way we usually think about it. I mean, it is, but it's like four different perspectives telling different aspects of the same story. So it's really, you're in the head of whose point of view it is at that moment, kind of narrating both their thoughts and what's happening.
Yeah, and one thing, there were many other points of view expressed in the novel that Alexander and Jim decided to get rid of. And so they zeroed in on those four characters, Paul, Tammy, and especially Mr. M and Tracy.
Some people say I'm an overachiever, but I think they're just jealous. My mom always tells me I'm different, special. And if you look at all the things I've accomplished so far, I think you'd have to agree.
It's immoral and it's illegal. Jim, come on. I don't need a lecture on ethics. Okay? I'm not talking about ethics. I'm talking about morals.
What's the difference?
I mean, I would say Mr. M was, to me, the sort of primary voice of the film, now that I'm thinking back, but also really sort of dark and subversive at times. Like, did MTV push back at all on that, or were they sort of on board for the tone from the get-go?
Well, as the story unwinds, there's kind of a split between MTV and Paramount. MTV was very, in general, much more supportive and friendly to what the film was aspiring to do, and Paramount as a studio, as we get further along in the story, have a different expectation and point of view toward all this.
Yeah, I would say it was an extremely important lesson for us. One of the key things about producing, particularly in a studio environment, is pushing the misunderstandings as far back into the process as you can possibly push them. And from the very beginning, MTV, it wasn't what they thought they were getting, but they loved it. Paramount, on the other hand, very much wanted a PG-13 movie. And as Alexander and Jim were developing it with us, it was getting increasingly more and more clear that it would be a hard R movie. Yeah. But that misunderstanding was able to be tabled through the writing of the script, the approval of the script, through the production, and it erupted deep into post. But thankfully, as I said, as producers, we very much embraced the movie that Alexander had in mind, and it was just a question of how do you get there, given that you have MTV on the one hand and you have Paramount on the other.
Right. Well, you must have had like huge proponents within MTV. Like you mentioned David Gale, but you must have had like real cheerleaders.
All the way up, all the way through. I mean, Van Toffler was a huge proponent, and Judy McGrath. I mean, ultimately, everybody at MTV, as the film went through production and then they saw cuts of it, they just loved it, even though on some level, like, what are we going to do with this? But they were very supportive.
Okay, so come back. So we've got a script, we've got our director, MTV supportive. They've greenlit it, or do you need to cast before they do that? Like, what was the process then?
That did become the next challenge, because the first role to cast, I mean, obviously Alexander went about looking for a couple of the roles at the same time, but the crucial role was Mr. M. And Paramount made us go through the process of Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks and all of the major actors of the day. Meanwhile, we very much had in mind, I don't know if you remember some of the specifics, Ron, but for instance, John Turturro was somebody that Alexander had brought up very early on, or even Ron Howard as an actor was somebody that he mentioned. So we were very far apart in the way that we were thinking about casting this movie. But ultimately, Sherry Lansing, who was head of Paramount at the time, came up with the great idea of what about Matthew Broderick? And that was sort of a great balance. There were people like John Cusack and Tim Robbins and all these people that were explored, but Matthew was the first person that Alexander was very excited about for certain reasons, and Paramount was very excited about for other reasons. And Alexander likes to always announce that he never saw Ferris Bueller, so he had no idea what that was about. But he thought Matthew was, it was very important to Alexander that the characters be believable and real.
He's so good with authentic casting that way. That is just so true across the board.
They had, Sherry Lansing gets credit in several key categories here, including that one. And when you see the film now, it's like hard to believe people didn't jump immediately to Matthew Broderick. He's so good in the role, and he's kind of a perfect symmetry. But a little bit, the studio, from their commercial point of view, had this idea, who do you know who's going to go to the prom with you unless you start with the most popular, desirable person? So it wasn't really exactly who fits that role, but if Tom Cruise or Tom Hanks or somebody might want to do it and they have so much more commercial value, why would you overlook that? That might be a little bit of why it took so long to get to Matthew Broderick. But he's kind of, Reese is fantastic, but he's on kind of he gets a lot of praise, but he's fantastic in that role.
He's very, he's so valuable in that movie and very underrated in how strong his performance was. But I should mention that Lisa Beach was our casting director, but to your point, Danielle, about he really wants these real, authentic characters. There was a guy named John Jackson who was a guy that we were going to film in Omaha, and John was a theater actor. Weirdly, he was in King of the Hill years before, but he's somebody that Alexander completely relied on for the local casting. And ultimately, John, years later, became Alexander's casting director on all of his movies. We later worked with him on Nebraska, but that's Alexander and John are in a very intricate relationship of unearthing people who aren't necessarily actors or who are community theater actors or whatever. And that's what really gives Alexander his movies their authenticity. And so anyway, it was a combination of Matthew coming as an idea from Sherry Lansing. Reese Witherspoon happened to be the very first person that Alexander met with for Tracy, and first person he met with, he was blown away by. So, Reese, I don't know what happened. She must have just in the audition, because he just came back saying, maybe I'll meet some other people, but this is Tracy. So that was great.
Was she, I know she had done that movie Man in the Moon, but was she really established at that point in other things? I'm just trying to remember where that is in the course of her career.
Well, one previous film I'd done as an executive producer before this came together was Jack the Bear, and she was in that with Danny DeVito. She wasn't that well known, really. And
did she read, or did she just meet with Alexander? Like, did she go on tape?
I don't know what happened in the room. We never saw any film, an audition or anything. It might have just been a meeting, but, he just was out of his mind enthusiastic, and that never happens with him. He must have seen on Nebraska, over 100 actors for the main parts, but that was a bingo moment with Reese. And then there was Chris Klein, of course. We hadn't cast that role. We were scouting high schools in Omaha, and Chris Klein came wandering down the hallway. And Alexander said, "What's your name, young fellow?" or something. And out of that conversation,
oh my God,
came his audition for election. And That's
Wait,
how...
he was just discovered like at the actual high school? I had forgotten that or did not know that. That's incredible.
No, it was incredible. And then as the movie went on, I remember Dee and Paramount, they were really excited about the dailies. And by the end of production, it was like Chris was going to be the next big thing. And of course, he did go on to American Pie and a bunch of other movies. But that was quite a nice find. But all the actors in that, Phil Reeves, who plays the principal in the movie, is incredible. And,
Oh my God, he's so brilliant. He's so good. He plays that part so well.
Yeah, and I could go on. And Jessica Campbell, who ultimately played Tammy, was just somebody that a local casting director that we had worked with before in St. Louis had suggested for that part. She was a young girl growing up in St. Louis who had never acted before, and so this was her first movie.
I had read somewhere that Thora Birch was originally Tammy. Is that wrong, or is that misinformation?
No, that's exactly right. And Thora was a very up-and-coming young actress that was very much on MTV's radar as well as Paramount's, and we had cast her in the movie. I don't think she had made anything major yet, but she was a known name amongst young actresses. But ultimately, unfortunately, her and Alexander did not see eye to eye on the role exactly. And Ron and I, unfortunately, had to let her go. It was probably the first or second day of production. And that was a very painful, difficult thing for everybody involved. But, I think partially Alexander, looking for that balance in a cast, Matthew Broderick was a known name, Reese was an up-and-coming actress, Thora was an up-and-coming actress, and he was, under a lot of pressure to try and balance the cast with fresh new faces that he likes to explore. And in this case, there was just a different conception of that character. I think Thora saw Tammy's rebellion as being very goth, like in that kind of young rebel who has a certain kind of look and style, outsider type. And I think Alexander is looking for somebody that was very real and very fresh in a sort of Midwestern way. And it just didn't work, and so that was a tough situation.
Oh God, those moments are so hard just as a producer, but the movie is so perfect, and I understand that need for balance, right? You can't have too many superstars because then it sort of overshadows the thing.
Well, and that's true, and also you never know how things ultimately work out for people, because Thora obviously went on to Ghost World and American Beauty, and those were signature performances for her. So, you never know the twists and turns you end up taking in your career, but she ended up doing great. So
you've cast the film, you're prepping in Omaha. Is the shoot relatively smooth? How is he as a director? I'm just curious to ask the producers about these sort of directors that have gone to such greatness. What were your observations about his style?
Well, I think, he was incredibly confident director, but I would also say extremely worried, given that this was his first experience with the studio, that there would be interference. And he didn't get Final Cut, which I remember was a huge deal to him. And I don't think it was even close, because, at that point in time, you really needed to carry a lot of weight as a director, and he'd only made one movie. But our feeling about it was that Paramount was making it in a very inexpensive way, and that if we stayed within the budget, that we weren't going to get interference. We weren't going to get much interference. And MTV was so supportive, and David Gale was very hands-on. Alexander was very worried that there was going to be interference. There really wasn't any. But he was also kind of on fire to make a very personal movie, in spite of the fact that it was at a studio with MTV behind it. But it wasn't an easy movie to make. Ron, there were plenty of obstacles that we had to navigate.
Well, we made it in the wrong season, right? There was snow on the ground, and the high schools, I guess, in Omaha didn't want it due to the content. So it was all at this high school that's outside of Omaha itself. Uniquely, it was shot while school was still in session.
Oh, God.
But it worked out nicely, because you see a lot of background, a lot of people in the halls that aren't really extras. There's people going to their classes. And it was
Plus,
able
we
to
had to film on weekends, quite a bit of weekend work too. But it's true. And do you remember we did that whole program where we would go into the various classes with the costume designer or the production designer and talk to the students about, we had made this deal with the school that it would be an educational experience for the students as well. Then there was also, Nebraska was a non-union state, a right-to-work state. The crew was very upset at certain points about the hours and whatnot, and so we had to really try and find the right balance of a kind of a humane work environment and trying to stay within the budget parameters.
What was the budget, guys? Do you recall the number?
It was about 8, right, Ron? And then
it's been published so wildly. Sometimes I've seen people say it was 25, which it wasn't. It was like 8 or 9.
It was 8 to make, and then there was a reshoot, which we can get to later, which added another $1.5 million to the budget.
Oh my God. Okay.
I know. It's funny. Once you stop filming and have to relaunch again, particularly in the case of our reshoot was shot in New York and Washington, D.C. and all that. So, expensive places to film. But anyway, back to the production. It was a hard movie to make, but the cast was amazing and the crew was great. And, there was a bit of tension with Alexander in the sense that the way he looked at it, it was, at least in that first time, this was our first experience working with him, there was his merry band of artists, which included Jane Stewart, the production designer, and Jim Glennon, the DP, and George Parr, the AD. And we were, at least initially, thought of by him as the man, and that was kind of the last thing that we thought of ourselves as. We, as producers, always see ourselves on the side of the movie, and, sometimes that means in alignment with the director, sometimes it means with the studio.
Right.
But we have an idea of what the movie is and just try and follow through with that. But gradually, we got along great with the crew and Alexander as well in the cast. And, it was a very harmonious experience for us.
Were you guys sitting on set by monitor? Because it was the first time you had worked with him. Were you sort of questioning? I mean, his style is so unique and his sense of humor is so unique and sort of dark. Were there moments where you're like, I'm not sure this is going to come together? Or were you always sort of confident on set?
I don't know. It seems like, he is very confident. He knows what he wants kind of in every way. So it's not like there's a lot of open discussion about what do you think of my options here. He's very, even going back to the casting, like when he saw Tammy on videotape with her braces and all that in Europe, that's who I want, never seen her in person. So anyhow, the same kind of sensibility was kind of on set, that he had very specific ideas of, nuances and details, like with the garbage and the way things are set up the shot to be slightly askew or whatever. So it wasn't a freewheeling open discussion, but you could always suggest something or make a comment. But I wouldn't say it was robust. It was fine, though.
He is very open to hearing from anybody, a PA on the set, a visitor to the set, as well as a producer. And he always says he'll listen to anything because he can always say no. And I think he knows that if it works out, whether it's his idea or somebody else's idea, he's going to get the credit for it. But it is true that he really knew what he was doing. And it was kind of an extraordinary thing for Ron and I that our very first 2 movies, between Soderbergh and Alexander, these are incredibly confident directors. I think maybe we even had the sense after that, well, this is how it's going to be all the way. And of course it isn't. But the thing about Alexander on Election, though, was he was much more uptight than he was on Nebraska. And I think it was because of this idea that the studio is lurking somewhere and they're going to infringe on his freewheeling creative thinking. It just really wasn't the case with Election. There was very little interference, but by the time we had worked with him on Nebraska, he was a much more relaxed, calm director. But the good thing about Election was he was hungry to make a bold movie, and you could feel it in the way that he was approaching each day on set.
Yeah, I think, Danielle, if you mentioned you just saw the film, it seems like that film has so much rich interwoven ideas, themes, and specific touches that it's a film that we love watching again and again because it just seems to not have extraneous notes in it. Everything is so nicely connected, even though it might seem like it's a sprawling story. It's really a very tightly connected story.
The only promise I will make is that, if elected, I will immediately dismantle the student government so that none of us will ever have to sit through one of these stupid assemblies again.
Are you okay, Mr. McAllister?
Yeah. What happened to your eye?
I'm fine. It's just a bee sting.
And then there are these bizarre allegorical moments, like the bee stinging him by the tree. And I'm just there are these moments that not many filmmakers could get away with, but it just totally works so brilliantly.
Yeah, that was Jim and Alexander. They came up with that bee sting, and that wasn't in the novel. A lot of that script is in the novel, although changed. And, among the big changes was also Tracy's character. I mean, Reese really brought the character of Tracy Flick in the novel is much more real, I'd say. But Reese brought this kind of otherworldly energy to it that was completely her and Alexander's collaboration on that character, and it turned into a whole different deal.
Yeah, I mean, she's become her own sort of noun, Tracy Flick. It's just how you refer to certain people in the world, and that is such an incredible achievement to have that much impact. Was Reese, I mean, she was so young, but did you just feel like she was such a talent and powerhouse from the jump? Yeah,
I thought it was pretty evident that she was, completely embracing the challenge of that character and making the most of it. I remember one day in particular where, she loses the election and she's supposed to her mother brings her a tranquilizer with a glass of milk to calm her down, and she's bawling her eyes out. And I remember she was completely distraught. She was every bit feeling that entire thing. And I remember trying to console her. She was almost inconsolable, but that's how, seriously she was taking the challenge of that character. Matthew had a very different approach to his performance and was, very used to, I think, turning it on and off. He was kind of an old pro. But Reese, I think understood that this was going to be a really memorable character if she was able to deliver.
It's so interesting, the actors just observing the different ways. And I guess experience has a lot to do with your ability to turn it on and off. But, we can get into it another time. But I made that movie Honey Boy with Shia, and I know you guys worked with him too. But just speaking of actors who just don't turn it off, they inhabit that role so completely. And that is just who they are for those months. And then there are those actors who are such pros, it's just a day at work, and then you go home and you live your normal life. But it's so interesting to me, the way different people approach that.
Yeah, I mean, Reese certainly got deep in there with Tracy, but she also is, it's a very different experience than Shia.
Yeah.
Reese,
yes.
As Ron pointed out, very good child actor. And by then, I guess she must have been about 22, but, was very poised and all of that.
So you guys get through the shoot. It's obviously very cold. You have some issues with shooting in actual high schools because of the content. And then you get into the edit, and you worked with Kevin Tent, the editor?
Exactly.
Who's so brilliant. I mean, he's helped me on so many movies. I love him so much. But
he's our favorite editor.
But did it sort of come together from the get-go where you saw a first cut and you just thought, wow, this is going to be one for the ages? Or what was the process then?
Well, it was a very long process. They had an editing room on Larchmont. And I guess the joke was, I forget how many Thanksgivings or whatever passed. But part of that was, I might have this a little screwed up, the chronology, but there's 9 months or something where after the studio saw it and some testing, there was this sense that the, ending, which turned out to be 15 minutes of the end, should be changed, not just reshot, but a kind of different trajectory of the end of the film. And that was a debate, and it was interesting because, partly going back to what Albert said, what the studio on the Paramount side wanted was some kind of upbeat ending for these, young people that supposedly the audience would have wanted to end up happy. So, it's a more complex story than that. So that what was originally shot and what's closer to what's in the book was a kind of thoughtful, soulful connection between Mr. M and Tracy after he's, thrown out of the high school and he's, has to sell cars. And she comes to see him. He's not sure what her purpose is, but, it was a sensitive connection between the two of them. It had a little bit of a class element, which maybe might have been in the book more, that there's a lot of aspirational stuff of who's privileged and who has to do kind of the service jobs and who's, underclass and who's going to, go off to Ivy League schools and have power and money. And, she lives in a humble place with her mother. And obviously we've seen where Mr. M and his cohorts live. And so it's kind of like, for all this animosity, we're kind of in the same emotional, socioeconomic place. And they have a moment together, which is sort of like we're in it together. I mean, it's signing her yearbook. Anyhow, all that, of course, is not in the film. So there was a really rich debate about, well, then what does happen to Tracy and to him? And it went back and forth with a lot of discussion with Paramount until, this, what you see is finally accepted and was shot December of 1998, I guess. It was kind of a year later.
Yeah, that was actually Reese's idea, was that she would be working as an intern. Monica Lewinsky was looming large over the culture at the time, and Reese had the idea that Tracy should now be working as an intern in Washington, and Alexander, and Jim worked through that whole ending. But just to backtrack for a moment, as Ron mentioned, we spent our Christmas, and we had 2 Christmas parties in the editing room. And so, it was a very unusually long post. Part of the reason for that was that, Matthew Broderick, this idea of perhaps a reshoot was in the air, and he was making Godzilla at the time. So we had to wait for him. But part of it also is that Alexander and Kevin, at least back then, really liked a long post. And the first cut of this, or the assembly in the first cut of this movie, was ungodly long. And I remember there are people who should remain nameless, but they saw the first cut of this movie and said, I'm losing my job tomorrow. But it was, it took a long time to wrestle that movie into shape. And there were a lot of elements to it. There was a lot of structural things that had to be worked through, but then music was a huge component as well. That took a long time to figure out. Rolf Kent did an amazing job, and Dondi Bastone was our music supervisor, and Kevin and Alexander both have very strong ideas about music, but there was just a long time for this movie to take shape. But ultimately, we started testing the movie after a good year, and that's when the notion that we needed a different ending came into play. I was just going to say, ironically, the film tested terribly, and then we, eventually came up with, in conversations with Sherry Lansing, and, as I say, Reese contributed and all that, with this new ending, and then we tested it again, and basically it tested terribly again. But I think by and large the consensus of the group was that the new ending was the perfect way to land the movie. So we got to the right place.
And was there some producing involved in just even getting your filmmaker on board with the reshoot? Was that a sort of tough road to hoe, or was he sort of on board to try something different?
I think it took several test screenings with the same result to take the position that, yes, something isn't working here. And then he certainly did embrace it at that point. But I remember there was a period of time where there was some pulling out of hair, trying to get there. But before we had made the decision, here's where there was some interesting producing. Before the time we were going to do a reshoot, there was a decision made by Paramount that it was going to go straight to video because, for one thing, this whole R-rated PG thing erupted, and they said you had promised to deliver a PG-13 movie, and we said, yeah, but you approved the script. And so there was this whole argument, anybody who read that script would know. But also, there was a lack of enthusiasm on the marketing side at Paramount about what to do with this movie. And Ron and I slipped it to a person we knew at the New York Film Festival who was on the panel of people that decide whether or not to take the movie. And this person saw it with the original ending, and the New York Film Festival then reached out to Paramount and accepted the movie, and they hadn't even realized it had been submitted. So it was a kind of awkward moment in that for a movie like this to end up at the New York Film Festival is a huge honor, and therefore this whole conversation about straight to video sort of started to evaporate a bit because they knew that there was some level of support out there for the movie. However, they didn't feel that that was the right ending. But the New York Film Festival accepted it with the original ending, which is kind of an amazing thing.
So then did the lens start to change, like where they were like, oh, this is a prestige film once the New York Film Fest accepted it? Like, how did the marketing team sort of start to...
Well, it wasn't up and away from that point. The new ending was obviously cut together and put on the film. But, even at the end, there was no support for the film from Paramount. And thankfully, Sherry Lansing stepped in because they didn't want to spend any money on it. There wasn't going to be a premiere even. And Mark Fishkin of, Mill Valley Film Festival and the San Rafael Film Center came down, and he wanted to see it because they were going to open that whole facility, have a grand opening, I guess, around April of 1999. And I don't know, Albert, whether we talked a lot about it. I was kind of nervous that he was going in to see it because Paramount had felt it was such a stray dog of a film that would barely be put out in the marketplace that it rattles everybody's confidence. Anyhow, to his credit, he wanted to use it as opening night of the entire thing, which was a big deal. And that became basically our premiere, although Allison Jackson then later through Paramount was able to have a premiere at the Egyptian. But all that was very last minute, and it came through Sherry Lansing because she kind of called us to congratulate us on something with the film, like, that it's about to come out. And we said, well, that's great, but there's no support for it. And then, Albert, as you remember, we faxed all the information to her about what was happening to her house. And then the next morning, department started calling us and saying, we're so pleased to invite you to do this or that, or bring people in to that, pre-established opening of the San Rafael Film Center. But before that, it was like, we're just not going to spend any money, so don't come asking for any money.
Well, although the one thing I would also add, Sherry was extremely supportive of the movie at that point, and then, then the marketing people get into it and they have their plans, and then Sherry, as Ron said, came to the rescue again at the very end. Operating a release. Now, with that said, the film, they platformed the film, and it opened on, about 15 screens. It got amazing reviews. I think it was the best reviewed film of that year. I think it was number one on the 100 Films of the Year or whatever, Premiere Magazine. But the problem was, then they really got behind it once the reviews came in, but they went from 15 or 25 screens up to 800 immediately in 2 weeks, and there wasn't the preparation for that kind of going wide so quick, so sudden, so quick, and the movie kind of eventually imploded and did not make a tremendous amount of money. I forget what the final numbers were, but it was probably in the, $10-12 million range as far as what it earned at the box office, but the critical response was sort of off the charts.
It's a squeaker, Mr. M. I've got Tracy by a vote. Just one vote.
So the critical response was so strong. When did you start to feel that the movie had more impact than like what the box office was reflecting?
Well, one thing, just experientially, is we like to go to that theater on La Brea. What was the name of that theater?
Showcase or the show?
Something like that. It was standalone. It would be sold out with a line, and you could stand in the back, and it'd be like a celebration of, I don't know, film and American culture and how weird it is. But that's a great experience. You don't get on every film where people are finding it wildly entertaining, but also of substance. And then, those reviews certainly helped. And then, that it fit into all these ideas about ambition and political opportunism, and whether, the debate still goes on about Tracy Flick, and was she the antagonist really, and, was part of the criticism of her that because the place of women who want to succeed and be ambitious has changed. I mean, what'd she want to do? She wanted to transcend her limited background and participate in everything and be president and do it all. So people could say, as some of the kids in the film, like, oh, we're just a bunch of slackers. We don't like that you're doing that. But I mean, there's been so many articles written even a month ago that are think pieces about the meaning of the film and Tracy Flick as a character.
She's actually the heroine if you look at it through a different lens. She was prepared and educated and wanted to further the school's ambitions, and that's actually pretty good. Yeah,
and just as a footnote, even though I tried to be fair to that original ending in my rendition of its sensitivity to both characters, but I'm Albert and I were on different sides of the version that was reshot. I think it's really brilliantly written. Matthew Broderick tries to overcome himself as he's standing on a street corner in Washington, D.C. and say that he feels bad for her, but feeling bad only goes so deep. What he really feels is anger and having her once again, wildly succeed while he's stuck with a crappy job and sitting alone with a malt in his hand. So I think it was a great way to go.
I totally agree. And I don't know if this is true or not, but is it Obama's favorite political film?
That's what he told Alexander a couple times. And, and obviously Tracy Flick has, anytime Hillary Clinton or Sarah Palin or somebody emerges, there are always comparisons. And, of course, Tom Perrotta has written a great new novel, Tracy Flick Can't Win, which takes on her story 25 years later. It just came out, and it's a worthy continuation of her character's journey. Yeah, I mean, Tracy is never far out of the public consciousness.
I mean, it's incredible. I read the book, actually, the new one over the weekend, and I wondered, should there be a sequel? Like, should we know where Tracy ends up, or is it just left alone? I mean, I think it's such a perfect piece of filmmaking.
I can't believe you're asking that. There absolutely should be a sequel. There's no doubt in the world.
I think it's a very unique opportunity when you have a character to pick her up 25 years down the road and explore what may or may not have worked out for her, and where she is at this moment, where the culture has changed so profoundly from when we've made the first one. So we'll see what happens, but we're very excited about the prospect of it.
Oh, that makes me so happy. I feel like we have like a little piece of information there, and like Reese is obviously the perfect age, and it would just be fantastic to see that.
Yeah, no, everybody, Alexander, Reese, everybody would be very worthy partners to continue the journey. So.
Well, you guys are fantastic. Such great storytellers. Thank you for going back in the memory bank for this one. It really is such a incredible film, and I hope you realize what a legacy you guys have created in it. And you guys are heroes of mine, so thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
That was fun.
Yeah.
So Bex, that was such an informative episode.
Yeah, I recently rewatched Election as well. The film really was so brilliant in its complexity. And at the time, in the 90s, it was so full of these bubbly high school movies and teen movies like Clueless and 10 Things I Hate About You and She's All That. That's what was out. And this film really changed the game and brought this depth and this darkness to the high school experience in this really subversive way, like that you said earlier defines what Alexander Payne does. It's such a classic, and it holds up because the themes are universal. They're not specific to the 90s like some of those movies are. And so I just think it's brilliant. So it was really great to hear about how it all came together.
Well, it's so funny because MTV financed the film and they had to deal with Paramount at the time. And I think they were sort of new in the film game. But I think their instinct was to sort of gravitate towards things that felt sort of novel or youthful or sort of outside of the box. And this certainly was that. But I think once they made the film, I don't think they truly understood how subversive a filmmaker Alexander Payne was. And so I was so fascinated by Albert and Ron's sort of producing of that moment. When the studio wasn't happy with the cut, they were in the edit for over a year. They had to reshoot. They spent $1 million on the reshoot when they only spent $8 million on the entire film. I was just like, that's insane. And then there was talk of putting it out on video. Like there was a moment where this movie was never going to come out. And I was just like, oh my God, so how do you produce your way out of that? And then they secretly submitted it to the New York Film Festival. And that sort of changed the whole game, it seemed like to me.
Yeah, there was a moment in this when they said that being a producer is being on the side of the movie. And sometimes that means being on the side of your director, and sometimes that means being on the side of the studio. And I think for me, and I can't speak for you, but one of the hardest things that I found about producing is balancing that, the creative and the business side of the business. Mm-hmm. And you have to manage your director and make sure they're happy, but you also have to recognize that this movie has to be successful and people want to go see it. Yeah. So they did that so well. They handled that incredibly well. And I think we should talk a little bit about why it's rare for studio financed movies to go to film festivals, because for them to submit it without the studio knowing and then for it to get in was probably mind-blowing to the studio and really changed the game. And it's secured for them that their film is actually going to get released and they're going to have the studio support. So why is it rare for studio films to go to film festivals?
Well, I would say, especially in that situation, it felt like the film, they were sort of seeing it as a little piece of business, like a throwaway film that they didn't know what to do with. And having the mark of the New York Film Festival, which is like one of the most prestigious festivals in the world, forces the studio heads to change the lens, right? Suddenly it's like, oh, well, this may be a prestige film. Maybe this is a film that's going to get really good reviews. Like that's a whole other path than thinking of it as like an MTV young kid film. You know what I mean? And so I think that they were really smart in knowing that Alexander Payne was like a very serious filmmaker and he had more to say than just like throwing this film out on video. So I was super impressed with that. And then they were right. Once the film came out, I mean, it got like incredible reviews from the New York Times and the New Yorker, and that kind of sent it on its way.
I also think it was really funny that Alex Payne, when they said, hey, you want to come in and meet with Paramount? He said, oh, I don't do that. And he had just done a student film and his first feature hadn't even been released yet. And so it's funny because as a producer, I was thinking you would hear a director say that and I'd be like, oh man, I don't think I'd want to work with this director because he doesn't even want to go meet with a big studio. Yeah. So the fact that they were like, no, his confidence is part of his voice. Yeah. And they saw that in him and they stuck with him and it paid off. Because like you said, it was an extremely successful film, you know, not necessarily right when it came out, but the legacy it's had and the fact that it launched Alexander Payne's career is pretty incredible.
It really is one of the great films of Alex Payne's and of our generation. So I'm so psyched that we explored it.
And I can't wait for the Tracy Flick sequel because I will vote for her for president any day.
I know, me too. So excited. All right, Bexy. So guys, we're having just the best time doing this. I mean, honestly, it brings us such joy. I mean, to be able to produce these little narratives about like great films in our history has just been like such an incredible delight. And I think that people are really starting to enjoy it. I'm going to read one of our reviews because we're starting to get great reviews. New favorite podcast. Who needs film school when this podcast exists? A must listen for anyone that loves to hear about the fascinating behind the scenes of how classic, indelible films came to be from the producers who willed them into existence. Shepherded week after week by one of the most prolific film producers working today. This is not written by my mother, by the way. Guys, we're so thrilled to be doing this. Keep listening, keep subscribing. We're at staygoldfeatures.com.
Our Instagram at staygoldfeatures.
We'll catch you next time, guys. Thanks so much.